Hello everyone and welcome to Saturn Returns with me, Caggie Dunlop. This is a new podcast that aims to bring clarity during transitional times where there can be confusion and doubt.
There's been such an energy exchange between both of us. I've seen it in myself and I think I've seen it in you, just that we were both really kind of rising into these roles that were both, that feel so authentic to both of us, I feel.
That's really true. We've kind of ignited each other.
Yeah, a lot.
Today I am joined by founder of renowned interiors brand Frances Loom, Kelly Vittengl. She is also a mental health advocate and host of Joan podcast and a spiritual seeker. But perhaps most importantly to me, she is one of my bestest friends. And a lot of you have requested an episode around female friendships, so I figured it would be appropriate to bring Kelly on for this final episode of Saturn Returns Season 1. So in this special episode, we discuss the importance of inner child work, the benefits of living abroad, and how media has sculpted an unobtainable ideal for women and how we can dismantle that. But most importantly, we discuss the wonders of triumphant platonic love and female friendship. During your Saturn return, and especially mine, friendship was an incredibly big theme. So I hope you enjoy this episode and enjoy our conversation, and we're just going to dive on in. So here's Kelly. Because you moved to London only a couple of years ago.
I moved to London roughly 3 years ago. But I've lived in so many different places. I've lived in New York City. I'm from New York. I'm from upstate New York. I've lived in New York City. I've lived in Los Angeles. I've lived in London. And all of these places I've moved completely on my own. But it's been such an interesting transition to London because I moved for love. And then he and I broke up. And I, going through my Saturn return was so intense for me. So I went through this period of time where I just was being pummeled to basically what felt like I was being forced to take off a mask that I had grown to sort of fake being this person. And it wasn't necessarily that I was faking, it was just
a version of you.
Yeah, it was just a version of me that I was putting out there that I was trying to be. I wanted to be so bad, but I was also not acknowledging so many parts of myself. There was all of this shadow that I wasn't acknowledging.
What was the sort of version of you that you were putting out?
Just I'd started this business. It was super successful. The Instagram followers, all of that stuff was happening. And I was and I wanted to be that person. And I had met this guy from Italy and he was beautiful. And we were just having this really beautiful Instagram life. And it was all this stuff because I'd put so much for my whole life. I'd put so much validation on my exterior, on the way I looked, on how people perceived me. I still struggle with that, how people perceive me. So what started happening was I started getting panic attacks sort of out of the blue. And it was I had one and then I had another one a month later and then another one 3 weeks later and then another one 2 weeks later. And then they just started coming on and on and on to the point where I was I felt like I was in a perpetual state of panic, 24 hours a day.
What is the sort of physicality of it to someone that's not actually? Because I think the term gets thrown around quite loosely now.
Yeah. So there's definitely a difference between an anxiety attack and a panic attack. Anxiety attack is more of this kind of sort of overwhelming, thoughts are everywhere, maybe some dissociation. My experience of a panic attack is I can remember I used to touch my skin because I just had this feeling of wanting to crawl out of my body. That's what it felt like. It was just get me out of here. It was shortness of breath, racing heart, just cannot control the mind whatsoever. You're gone. You're on another planet. I was so out of my body. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how to be the person that I had kind of molded myself to be. And the way that I describe the panic attacks now, looking back, it felt like my soul was screaming inside of my body. It felt like it was rattling inside of a cage, wake up. You have to wake up to who you actually are. And since then, I've been on such a journey of just self-discovery.
But would you then say that was sort of really when you begun to embark on your spiritual path? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say that was I'd been on a spiritual path for a while and had been interested in spirituality for a very, very long time. But it was really that breaking down of self, complete shattering of self. That's what it felt like for me. Everything I knew about myself everything I thought I knew about myself was demolished. So it was interesting because it was sort of this like rebuilding of self. It was sort of this like, okay, we have a blank slate, which is a really weird place to be in when you're 27. To be like,
but in hindsight, a really good place to be in.
Yeah, hindsight, really good, very good place. But it's so difficult to be, you know, to suddenly. I mean, in a lot of ways, I felt like a baby or something. I was like, okay, so how does this work again? How do I function in the world? And since then, it's just been this real journey of like, you know, a big one for me, and we talk about this a lot, is going back to childhood, really looking at my childhood. Which was very idyllic, and I have amazing parents, but something that's really kind of on the forefront of mental health right now is this looking at emotional trauma, which is not heavily studied. It's relatively new.
And how that fosters in the body.
Yeah. Because emotional trauma, I was talking to my mom the other day and she was like, is there like a different word? It just sounds so intense. And I said to her, I was like, a very sensitive child could be yelled at. So it's not actually about the event. It's about how one processes it.
Or
doesn't process it.
And it's really subconscious.
It's
as
all
well.
subconscious.
Yeah.
That's the challenging part, is that you have to do so much deep diving into your own subconscious, into your own patterning, into the way that you look at the world. I mean, it requires a pretty intense amount of dedication and awareness, to be honest. Like, you have to be willing and want and wishing to do the work, because the other thing is it doesn't feel particularly good.
Oh no, it's incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable.
And also, to go back to what you mentioned about 27, like when we are reaching 27, or when we are like growing up towards that age, we have this whole lifetime of conditioning and experiences, and we're set up, we think we know everything, and we think we're on this trajectory, and we're like, by 30, like, I've got it. And then suddenly everything just is like, and like blows up in your face. And then it goes against everything we think we should be in society and to have achieved and
and
know
that's
about
all
ourselves.
Conditioning. That's all the stuff that society and our families, love them all, have like put on us, because it's just the way that it's been. So there is this massive awakening happening right now, where people are realizing that they're unhappy, and everybody's like, wait, but why? And it's realizing that we're all conditioned out of ourselves.
But then also, going back to that point of when things do feel like they're collapsing, it's very easy for us to have this conversation in the hindsight on the like
100%.
Other side of it, and you do just suddenly, it's like coming out of this tornado, and you're like, oh, that was completely necessary and actually like really benefited me. But at the time, like, if someone had told me, I would probably be like, what the fuck do you mean? And how, I don't know whether I would have had, well, I definitely didn't have the tools, but whether I would have had the stability to go into that work, to do the inner child work, because you do need to be safe.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of it, is that you have to start building safe relationships outside of yourself. So there's a term called co-regulation, which we all need. Like, we're creatures of community. We have to be around other people. There's like, it's massively beneficial to our health to be around other people. Yeah.
That actually reminded me of, I say his name wrong, so is it Gabor Mate?
Gabor Mate,
who you adore.
Yeah,
and you introduced me to. And he was talking about how children can't actually like regulate their
No, they can't.
Emotions.
It's actually impossible. Like, biologically, children can't regulate their own emotions. So if they get angry, they don't know how to
calm themselves down.
Turn the anger down. They need someone else, the parent, caretaker, sibling, whomever, to bounce that emotion off of in order to
regulate
it down, to regulate it. And if that emotion goes unregulated, if the child is sent to their room or whatever it is to deal with it on their own, oftentimes what happens is that emotion gets repressed, and then it gets stuck, and then it turns, here we are, like, having panic attacks at 27. It's so interesting. My mom and I have been talking a lot about my own childhood, and my parents are wonderful, and my mom was an amazing mom, but we've been talking about the ways in which I felt under-parented, I guess. And I said to her this morning, I said, as a society, as a world, as a Western world, we are literally emotionally illiterate is the word that I used. Like, we live in such a value-driven, not the good kind of values, I guess. It's
monetary value.
Yeah, monetary value, physical value,
Material.
yeah, material value. That's the word. It's like everything's about like how you look, how much money you're making, what you're doing, and it just isn't serving us. And look around, it's literally crumbling. Like it's crumbling.
So going back to the inner child stuff, because I know that a lot of people are curious about it, and it is, I don't think it's by any means a new thing, but I think it's been some of the most valuable work you and I have done, for sure.
1000%.
Because I would say that everybody would benefit from doing inner child work.
Everyone has a wounded inner child.
Yeah. But some people will
Everyone.
probably be like, I don't know if I need to. I don't know whether that resonates with me. What would you say are the sort of signals that perhaps you have some work to do?
Oh my God. There's so many. Relationships are like the first place.
Yeah,
that
and
one
can we just go into that? Because I was reading Alain de Botton. I always sound like such an idiot when I pronounce his name with a French accent, but I don't want to call him Alan.
Alain de Botton.
But he talks about, how in relationship we automatically go into this space of often a child-parent dynamic. And I know personally, I definitely fall into that role. And also just without even thinking about it, call each other baby and use baby voices. And when he wrote it down, when I read it, I was like, that's so weird.
Yeah.
But it's so normal.
Yeah. So often what's happening is when we go into relationship on a subconscious level, we're trying to heal a wounded relationship from childhood. So there's usually one parent that you have a bigger wound with than the other, depending upon who raised you.
We all just listened to that and one person came to mind.
And what's happening is that as a child, when you were trying to have your needs met, which our core needs are being seen and being heard. And when those things aren't happening, that's when children start to act out, like when they start to scream, when they start to, they're trying to get your attention some way. So if they couldn't heal it then, there's always this kind of, again, it's subconscious. We don't see it on a conscious level. This attempt to heal that relationship for ourselves through another person. So there's often someone else will show up. Oftentimes it's a mirror for what we need to see within ourselves.
And also the most fucked up part is that we're super attracted to it.
Yeah.
You're literally ooh.
Well, because it's comfortable too, because that's what we know.
Familiar.
It's familiar. That's the thing. It's familiar.
So basically a massive thing is kind of unpinning your concept of love and what that might have been growing up. And what you observed in the family. Yeah.
So again, it takes I can imagine that people listening to this are having, there's going to be so much resistance to doing it. The ego will literally be like, nope, don't want to talk about it. Don't want to think about it because it's painful, because it doesn't feel good. It's uncomfortable. Like we said before, it doesn't feel good to do this work.
Well, going back to what you said about being seen and being heard, we also have these driving forces of wanting to go through and be our best selves, but also the child, the inner child and the ego is we want to stay safe. We're not doing any of this shit. La 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 la. Let's block out our ears and not do this, because it's the unknown just terrifies everybody.
Yeah. The ego basically is trying to protect the shadow. And what the shadow is just the parts of ourselves that we believe are unlovable, which is untrue. All human beings are worthy and valuable and lovable. And that's the thing, is that so many of us grew up believing that love was conditional. Even a parent who was scolded you for having bad grades. That tells a child that I'm not loved if I don't have good grades.
X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
So there's that value system again. It's I need to be this. Or if a parent put emphasis on looks, it's I need to look a certain way in order to receive that love from them.
It's just kind of revisiting those things. I think a thing for both of us, I definitely, and I spoke about it when I did the solo podcast, is this idea that I'm not lovable unless I look a certain way. And that isn't just prescriptive to relationships. That's the wider society in general. It's I cannot achieve and I cannot be deserving of all these things until I am essentially perfect, which of course is just the can keep being kicked down the road because it's not achievable.
Completely. Yeah. And also you already are perfect. That's the whole thing, is that we literally are all already perfect. But the other thing to look at is emotional trauma doesn't just happen from parents and from family. It happens from society too. Yeah. So a way in which I felt, that I was affected by society, say, was growing up. It sounds silly, but growing up watching the Victoria's Secret fashion show. I saw these women on TV who looked a certain way. I was 9 years old when I first watched it with Tyra Banks. And I was like, oh, like, look at them. Look at everyone else looking at them. That's what it looks like to be a woman and like a wanted woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, all the media we absorb,
yeah.
really.
Oh my God, completely. It's like, it's all of the beauty commercials. I mean, it's all of this, I don't necessarily want to call it capitalism, but it's this like, you need this in order to be this.
It is. Yeah.
It's like all of the commercials were fed, and women, my God, it's like, it's just so over the top for women. It just really, really gets me going when I start to talk about it and think about all of the ways in which so many women around the world are just...
Don't feel good enough.
They don't feel good enough.
And I'm kind of jumping into a bit of a off tangent, but I was listening to something the other day that kind of how this correlates to our sexuality or lack of sexuality, because that's such a big part of it, that it's like, to be sexual and to be desired, you need to look this way. Mm-hmm. And if you go through your whole life never feeling like you do, which most people don't, you don't feel you have ownership over your own sexuality or over your own body, or like you are deserving completely of that part of you.
Yeah. You become a slave to being better all the time.
And to serving other people.
Yeah, to serving other people, to not feeling good enough, to feeling like you need to be X, Y, and Z for this person, or, you know, I mean, and I still have it come up. Like, I've done so much work on this, and I still think about going into a relationship, and I get this like, oh God, like that feeling of not being perfect, like perfectionism. People laugh when I say I'm a recovering perfectionist, but I mean, I swear to God, it's like, it's so true. I mean,
I know. But I mean, I think you are more like the classic perfectionist than me, because we've got a lot of similarities, but then we're also like, I'm like, I mean, just to go back to when we did a pasta making course, and yours were like perfect tortellini, and mine was just like a big pile of mush. And you were just like grinning, and I was like, I know who you were at school. We wouldn't have been friends.
Well, that's the thing, is that we all carry it differently. So like it depends on, again, where like our wounding is.
So we really need to catch ourselves at like, because the thing is, we think these things because we have our entire lives and we never question them. Mm-hmm. And like a massive thing for me is just to stop yourself and go, why?
Yeah.
Like when I'm like, oh, you can't get in a relationship yet because you haven't achieved this, or you haven't got that, or you don't weigh this.
Right.
And just being like, why? Who the fuck says?
But that's kind of the beauty of the Saturn return, is that like you sort of have to start nearing rock bottom in order to make change. Like, it just is the way that it is. Humans we don't
You can't bypass that.
You cannot bypass that. You know, which is what the Saturn return is for, I think, in a lot of ways. It's like, oh, let's course correct you, like back to who you are, who you really are.
Mm-hmm. And I think a huge thing that you realize is that we feel like everyone is behind us going, you need to do this, you need to do that. And sometimes that's true, but most of the time it's just us being like, this is who you've got to be before you can be
totally
worthy.
Yeah.
Essentially.
But it's also so important for us to develop and have compassion for the reasons why we're telling ourselves these, you know, quote unquote lies. Like, and that goes into just, again, doing the work and like realizing listening to, becoming aware of that voice in your head and being like, what am I? How do I actually speak to myself? What am I telling myself? Because oftentimes it's just lies that are trying to keep you protected. Mm-hmm.
And also comparison, I think, is such a huge one, because we go through school, we go through life, all doing things at the same time. And then it suddenly becomes a bit of a free for all, and everyone's advancing at different stages. And it's interesting, like your experience versus mine, because you had this successful business and then you moved to England and stuff was like from the exterior thriving.
Oh yeah.
Whereas I would definitely feel like I wasn't, but I would look at someone like you and be like, why don't I have it figured out like she does? And yet you were going through, why? And yet you were going through your own experience.
Syndrome. Oh my God, completely. Yeah, I mean, no one has it together, by the way. Like, no one. I mean, people are certainly moving, like we're moving in a direction that is more, we're shifting towards being more in our authentic selves. And I think that, you know, as we get there, we're reaching places in which people truly are like living their purpose and are truly authentic. Mm. But I mean, I can tell you right now, the majority of human beings on this planet all feel like there's got to be something more, and that everyone else is doing something right that they're not doing. Mm. I mean, we all feel like that imposter syndrome is just, it's like I honestly think it's a part of like the human condition.
And it doesn't matter who you are or what you've achieved.
No, not at all.
Yeah, it all comes with its own pressure.
Yeah.
So going back to friendship, because a lot of people have, like I mentioned to you, and that's why I wanted to, I kind of knew we were going to go off on inner child stuff, but a lot of people have asked me to do a piece around female friendship. And I think that, you know, I definitely went through, I had like my friendship group that I had in London, and this like version of me that was very established, that I built up throughout like my teen years and early 20s, and then like was behaving however I was behaving. But there was something in me that was just like, this is not who I want to be. And I kind of need to separate myself from this in order to explore that version. Because not only do we have our own narratives, but like you go and meet up with a friend and they have their version of you. And I always have this really, like, it's so interesting how you can feel that. But I was always such a chameleon that I would just be like that person straight away. That was my survival, was like, be whoever you need to be to fit in and make people feel comfortable and be feel loved.
Yep.
And for people to feel like good around you. And I remember one of my friends called me out on it. She was like, there's a different Caggie for every friend.
Yeah. My sister called me out on the same thing.
And I didn't realize, but she'd spent time with me like with a few different people. And she was like, you know, I think that I know you and that there's like my Caggie, but then I see like another one. But I didn't even realize I was doing it. And that became exhausting in itself because I wasn't living for myself.
Yeah.
And that's something now I think I've really, that takes a huge amount of discipline and like courage to master, because when you start remaining like a bit more still in one version of who you are and cultivating that, some people just fall by the wayside, and that's a difficult process.
Well, and there's quite a bit of grief that comes up with that too. Like you're grieving old parts of yourself or parts that don't serve you anymore, but that you have an attachment to them. So you're letting go of like these versions of yourself that kept you safe. You're letting go of friendships. You're letting go of a lifestyle. You know, like there's so much that falls to the wayside, and it could be just as intense as like losing a person.
Well, we talked so much about the pain of a breakup of a relationship, a romantic relationship, but we rarely acknowledge the pain of a friendship dying.
Yeah, completely. And it happens all the time. Almost every friendship that I've had a couple of experiences. We have a different experience in that, like, I still have my friends from high school, but they're like my friends from high school. And because I don't live there, like you still live in the place that you grew up in. If I still lived in my hometown, like I can't imagine that I would be hanging out with the same people that I was when I was young, you know?
Because I've moved around a lot too, and that is such a blessing, and it gives you this ability to actually start discovering who you are. And I know it's quite a luxury and not everyone can, but I think a lot of people are super fearful of embarking on something like that solo, but I cannot recommend it enough.
Yeah, same.
Because you get to discover like other aspects of yourself.
Oh, completely. Every time I've moved somewhere, every time I like land in a new place where I don't actually know anyone, I'm like, okay, like what, like who do I want to be? You know, like, are there parts of myself that I was too afraid to show in old friendships or something? Like, how can I actually step more into my authenticity as who I am with people who I can't really be afraid of, like, how they're going to take it, because...
Well, they have no past version of you to attach themselves onto.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, because oh my God, when I went back to Australia... So I was super wild when I was in Australia when I lived there. And I went back at Christmas. And of course, like the version of me now that feels fairly established and like grounded and like the version you know, if you came with me and heard way people, people were coming up to me and they were like, Caggie, I don't know if I told you this, but this girl came up to me. She was like, last time I saw you, you were iguana wrestling. And I was like, I'm sorry, who are you? I didn't even... recognize her.
And you were literally wrestling an iguana.
No, iguana wrestling is this thing that you put like belts around your head and you get on the floor and you like wrestle. What? And I was just like, oh, that's the kind of shit I used to do at like 4 a.m. in the morning with a bunch of people like partying. But it was just, it was you know, no pun intended, a really sobering moment for me to be like, wow, that was the version of myself I was then. And then to like skip to in LA, that was really when I started to be like, I don't want to be, you know, in that partying environment. I just want to be a bit more grounded. And like if you ask people in LA about me that knew me, they were like, yeah, Caggie doesn't drink. She's like super, you know, hermity, blah, blah, blah. But then the people back in London that I grew up with would be like, really?
Yeah.
And so, you know, they're all versions of me.
Yeah.
But I think moving abroad gives you the opportunity to choose.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. It can be difficult though, because, you know, I have people ask me all the time, like, how have you made friends? How have you found friends? And
London's particularly tricky too.
I know. All of you girls are like, how on earth did you like land in this group of people?
I've had American friends that have moved and I'm like, you're gonna hate it. And they literally come back after a couple of weeks. They're like, nobody wanted to be my friend.
Because it's like England is so much smaller than America and everyone just knows each other. So there's like not a whole lot of like room for someone who's not from here to like wiggle their way in.
It's a cultural thing as well. We're very closed
cultural,
off.
Yeah. A friend of mine, her ex-boyfriend is English and she's American. And he used to say that Americans are like peaches and that Brits are like coconuts, where Americans are like soft and juicy on the outside and like welcoming and warm. But then there's like a pit on the inside. It's like hard to get in once you actually get to the center of them. And then Brits are like really hard on the outside, but then once you crack them, then there's
you're
like,
in.
Yeah, then
That's
you're in.
That's so true.
I know.
That is so true. Because like when I was in America, everyone was so friendly, but it always felt like quite surface level.
Yeah.
And like I would kind of be friends for like a couple of weeks or months and then just like never see them again.
Yeah.
Whereas here it's like once you make that friendship.
Yeah, then
you're in.
Then you're in.
You're in.
I'm in.
You're in. You're in. Don't you worry. So I guess we've been pretty lucky with the friendships that we found, but it takes a minute.
We have. It does. It takes a minute. And like since I've been in London, which has been a couple of years, there have been friendships that I've had that have faded away, you know? Like I've also had periods where I've tried to force friendships, you know, where I've like wanted when I first moved here, especially because I moved here for a relationship and we were together and then we broke up after 7 months. And then I was going through that whole grieving process and that was kind of a whole nother layer of this like Saturn return thing.
Well, I don't know whether you did this, but I think a lot of people in relationship, myself included, you kind of, especially if you move for them, your life is like an extension of their life. You just kind of, you're an accessory in their life, really.
Yeah, and I didn't know anyone here. So like we broke up and I was like, okay, all my friends were his friends. So what do I do now?
Yeah, that's hard.
It was really hard. So I had like a year of grieving that and really kind of staying indoors. And like, that was like a whole nother sort of process of this sort of spiritual awakening, if you want to call it that, was this learning. Because I'd been a serial dater, since I was like 15. I hadn't been single for more than 3 months.
Really?
Mm-hmm. So Leo and I broke up and I was like, okay, wow, I'm single. And now it's been 2.5 years. This is the longest I've been single in my life. But now I can look back and I'm like, oh my God, I needed this because, again, the same thing. I needed to do a lot of soul searching. I was always looking for myself in men. And also, I hadn't established friends here. Looking back on all of it, I'm like, wow, this has been so beautiful. Like the female friendships that I've created, that we've created and our other friends, it's been honestly some of like the most beautiful relationships in my life, especially for where I am now, like as the person I am now, which feels like the most authentic version of myself thus far in my life.
And therefore to be seen in that version of you completely. And like loved and held and carried.
Yeah.
Did you anticipate that? Were you looking for it or did it just kind of happen?
No. I wanted friends. I knew that. But like there was a level of like manifestation that occurred. So in kind of going through that breakup and like really going through a whole nother level of like finding myself and figuring out who I really am without a partner was super important. And to really like stick through that, it did sort of feel like when I did start to put out the call for girlfriends and like they just started coming in, I mean, it did feel sort of like this magnetic thing that was happening where it was like I was again stepping into my authenticity and then like in came friends. And it was always so serendipitous
Yeah, because I wouldn't necessarily say I was seeking out. What I was seeking out was something else, as in like, I need another way of living my life. I'm looking for something else. I don't know what the fuck that is, but like, this isn't serving me. This isn't right. And what the hell else is out there? And people kept coming into my life in the most random ways. Like, and I too, like you, was very much like relationships, romantic relationships was such a huge part of my identity. But that often caused me to like zigzag off my own path a lot of the time. And my value was around like who I was in that relationship to that person. But then coming out of the last one at the end of last year, and then like you coming into my life and us like establishing this group, which is so nurturing. I never anticipated, and I call it like triumphant platonic love, because I never anticipated that a friendship could give me so much of the nourishment that a romantic partner does give. Of course, it's like completely different. But then when you start having those pieces filled by a different sort of love, you don't need that romantic one as much. Like, of course, you desire it and you can want it. And we talk about, you know, what we want from a partner all the time, but we're not like sitting around being
just want a hug. Just want a hug.
But even speaking to some different like girlfriends that perhaps, you know, they all got married like wildfire. And I think they look at me as like a bit of a black sheep. They're just like, why won't you settle down? Like, because I just don't need to right now. Unless it's the right person, like I don't need to. And I think we give each other that support system, which is such a nice thing.
Well, that's what's been so nice about meeting you. Like, there's been such like an energy exchange between both of us. I've seen it in myself, and I think I've seen it in you, just that we're both like really kind of rising into these like roles that we're both, that feel so authentic to both of us, I feel.
That's really true. We've kind of ignited each other.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah, because the last 9 months have definitely been of rapid growth.
Yeah. I mean, same for me.
Because we call each other out on shit too.
Yeah, which is also so important, by the way. Like, that's a whole nother conversation, but...
Well, I think women can be quite catty towards each other in a way that I haven't observed with men in the same way. Like, men are straight up like assholes to each other, as that's their form of bonding, and it's funny and it's character building and, you know. But whereas women can be a lot more behind each other's backs. And
this again goes into, you know, if we want to go down this road, and we've talked about this, it's that feminine wound. It's that like ancient feminine wound where we've been living in, you know, I don't want to get too feministic here, but we've been living in a patriarchal society for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where men have been, you know, in power and women are seen as lesser than. And it's always been like, oh, who's the woman going to get in society? Like, there's always been this kind of undertone of like, first of all, women not being equal to men. We all know that. But also women against women, like who's got what, who's dating who's marrying who, like, and there's competition, and it's
because it's like there's like objectified ornaments on the shelf that are like, who are we going to pick? Therefore, once you get
what
picked,
do you look like? How do you cook? Like, are you like? It's always been about like what it is that we have to offer
a man
materially, and not, you know, historically it hasn't had to do really with like who the person is. So there's been this like, and again, it's why women are so easy to sort of, back to the capitalistic conversation, like, buy this makeup and you're going to look like, you know,
Claudia Schiffer.
Yeah, exactly. Women are susceptible to that kind of thing because it's just been hundreds of years of us just not being able to be authentically ourselves. We're not taught how to communicate. So now, you know, like, I'm learning. I feel like I've really been stepping into who I am and feeling really grounded in who I am. So, and learning how to communicate for the first time in my life and ask for what I want and what I need. And it can be difficult, but all of a sudden when you start doing it, like when you start, you know, with friendships, like saying, hey, this thing happened and it didn't make me feel that good. Like, can we talk about it? You realize that there is a way to have a dialogue, but we're so afraid to have that dialogue because we're also afraid of rejection, which again goes back to childhood and like...
Also, we're just not taught how to have...
Right.
Like
emotionally
you say,
illiterate.
No, yeah. And how to communicate and have confrontation in a healthy way. And then, like, you know, within friendship and also relationship, and then we harbour that or then speak behind each other's backs because
Yeah.
We don't want to go through that icky in between.
Yeah. Oh my God. I had such I can remember being in high school. All the older boys were into me and my friends because we were like fresh meat coming in. And there was so much competition between me and my best friend. And I remember wanting to put gum in her hair at a football game, which is so ridiculous.
I know.
But it's again, it's that that boy that I want likes her. There's no, for women, I think oftentimes men take precedent over the friendship. And men just don't have that as much as we do. Oh, you're into her? Okay, cool. Whatever.
There's plenty of them out there where it's been fighting over them.
Yeah, because we've been taught so much that so much of our value is in our partner and who we're with.
And being picked. And especially, it's a very unfair thing of, especially after 30, that, there's this mentality that men kind of come into their own and just get better and better and better. And whereas women, they're like, oh, why is she still single? And I've had conversations with guy friends about it. And they're like, oh, they literally will be like, yeah, but why is she single? She's X age. I'm like, are you fucking joking?
Oh my God, it makes me so crazy. Even again, back to media stuff. There was two Chanel ads that came out in the same year. Brad Pitt was in one of them, and it was an older supermodel in the other one. Chrissy Turlington, maybe. Brad Pitt's photo is rugged. You can see every wrinkle. They change the lighting in the image just to make him look more weathered, and he looks sexy as hell. And then you've got the Chrissy Turlington photo, and they're the same age, or maybe not, but roughly. And
she's edited to shit.
Complete, every wrinkle's removed, and it's what?
Is that messaging?
And that's the other problem, is that because it's been going on for so long, again, it's so subconscious to us. It is now considered radical for a woman to not get Botox.
I know. Which is awful.
Insane. I did an exercise a couple of years ago when I was feeling a lot of that pressure of oosh, maybe I should get my lips done. Or again, because of all of that subconscious programming that I needed to look a certain way.
So glad you didn't.
I know. I mean, well, now I look at my face and I'm like, oh, I love my face. But I did this exercise with myself where I wrote down everything about my body that I wanted to change. And then I flipped it. And I was like, okay, what is it that I love about my lips? And I was like, I love kissing with my lips. I love that they give me this opportunity and this ability to feel something with someone else.
So as a sort of antidote to that subliminal messaging, or not even subliminal, that messaging that's going out there all the time, it's to write a list of...
Again, it's kind of flipping the script. It's developing the awareness to sort of pinpoint what it is that you are telling yourself.
And why?
What is that voice in your head, and what is it saying to you? So just flipping the script, becoming aware of the thoughts that are negative, and figuring out, because they're never true. So there's this exercise. It's actually so good. Have you heard of Byron Katie? Okay. She's a spiritual teacher who developed this. It's called The Work. That's what she calls it. Where you ask yourself 4 questions. So if you have a thought about something, I recently had a friend. I walked through this exercise with her because her now boyfriend wasn't her boyfriend yet at the time. She was like, he's not responding to my texts, and he's not into it. He's not into it. And so I stopped her and I was like, okay, we're going to go through these 4 questions. 1, is that true? In the moment, you're completely convincing yourself that yes, it's true. So it's a yes or no answer. Oftentimes we say yes. So the second question is, can you be absolutely sure that that's true? So I said to her, can you absolutely know that he's not responded to you in a couple of hours because he doesn't like you anymore? No, you cannot be absolutely sure of that. Third question is, how do you feel when you believe that thought? So she started going through the list: insecure, sad, all of the things. And then the fourth question is, who would you be without that thought? So if you were in the same exact situation and you weren't thinking that thought, who would you be?
I love that.
And then what you do is flip it around. So then you take the statement, he's not calling me because he's not thinking about me or doesn't like me. And you say, he does like me. It's because you don't know the truth of the situation. So all you're doing is telling yourself.
You're making a choice.
You're completely making a choice.
And also it goes back to this idea that, through the media and advertising and all this messaging is basically to constantly tell us and remind us that our worth is outside of ourselves. So when someone comes into our life, if it's a guy and he's not responding, that feeling of like, oh my God, I'm worthless because he hasn't responded to me. Like now I actually don't have, because it's taken me a long fucking time to get there. But because I sometimes like my worth isn't dependent on that, nor is one's worth dependent on them getting X, Y, and Z done to their face so they can look like someone they've seen on social media.
Right.
And like, it's also, I'm going to misquote this, but it's like an educated and empowered woman has been long considered a dangerous thing. And that is, I think, both of our mission in different ways, that we want to make women like empowered and just do for like whatever resonates with them, with what we're discussing, that allows them to kind of take ownership over themselves and to start embodying some of this stuff, whatever that looks like and whatever practices they need to do. But to stop them being on this kind of like conveyor belt of society that's just like, this is how you have to think, and this 100%. Is what you have to be worthy of anything.
It's just so subconscious. It takes work, but it's so beautiful. Like doing the work and really beginning to look at yourself and like committing to yourself is really what's happening. Is just the most important thing that someone can do for themselves. I used to carry a notebook around with me and write out the questions and actually do that every time like a, quote unquote negative thought popped into my head. Just and
write it down
and go through those. And is it true? Is it, and just to flip the script for myself and like really, really commit to doing that, because it just does take work. It doesn't just happen.
Well, it's like that thing you put up on Instagram the other day. It's like, we can only, meet people as deeply as they've met themselves.
Yes, exactly.
And it's kind of the same thing. So you can't really just go from where you are to like having those kind of friendships. Like you need to begin that path yourself.
Yeah, agreed. And life ultimately, like everyone who comes into our life is a mirror. So like you do that work on yourself, you're going to naturally, magnetically start calling in people who are also doing the same thing.
What would your advice be on sort of trying to find those people, find like those women, if that's what you're looking for, those kind of friendships?
What I always recommend is like figure out what your interests are. So if it's like, if you are on a more spiritual path and that is like yoga or something, finding yoga classes, meditation classes, and going. I've never been too shy to like just walk up to someone and be like, hey, just like start chatting with them.
That's interesting, because when I was younger, I used to have a serious problem with doing anything on my own. Like I always had to have a friend. I was terrified. Whereas now I push myself to do things like on my own, because it's uncomfortable and it can be a little bit scary and a little bit uncomfortable, but like you always achieve something from it.
That's such a good point. I used to be the same way, and I remember being nervous like the first few times I went to yoga classes, as though like everyone in the room was looking at me. And now, I mean, like it's still terrible at yoga. I'm like the least flexible person ever, but I go and I could care less. Yeah. So again, it's kind of just like
those practices
Mastin
over
Kipp
time.
calls them disconfirming experiences, which is just, we have to put ourselves through experiences to disconfirm the belief that we have that like, oh God, I can't go alone, or like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to be looking at me. Like you just have to do it. Yeah. Honestly.
And then you realize that that's not true.
And it's not true. Exactly. It just takes practice. It just takes work. You got to like feel into the discomfort and just sort of push through it. And the more of that authenticity that you step into, the easier it becomes ultimately. And then the faster people start coming in. So
that's perfect.
Yeah, that's my recommendation.
Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Love you.
Love you.
I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and learnt something from mine and Kelly's conversation. Kelly always has the best advice for me, and it was such a gift that she came into my life when she did. And I know that as we transition through our 20s, friendships are a huge theme, and there can be a lot of grief when they end. So finding like-minded individuals is so important as we grow and develop. Now, it has been such a joy making this podcast for you guys, and I'm truly overwhelmed by the messages of support, and that has meant so much to so many of you. So we will be back after a little bit of a break, and I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to all of you who have listened and shared. It's been such an amazing journey for me, so thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. You can find Kelly's brand, Frances Loom, on Instagram at Frances Loom, or Kelly Vittengl, which we will put underneath because it's a complicated one to spell. And you can find me at Caggie's World. Saturn Returns is a Feast Collective production. The producer is Hannah Varrell and the executive producer is Kate Taylor. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. And remember, you are not alone. Goodbye.